Good evening, everyone. It is once again Ted the Speed Learner, and I'm going to review another movie tonight. This movie is entitled Silver Streak. Before I get started, though, I wanted to let you know I am running a live stream right now, and that's why I'm looking at you at an angle here. My laptop is right next to me, and so there may be some interruptions as I get feedback from my students during the live stream. If you're watching this outside of the live stream, I hope you enjoy this presentation. I have lots of questions to ask, and then I will tell you exactly what I thought of the movie. Alrighty, so hope you pay attention. Let's see. Now, if you're watching this right now, what I want you to do, if you're watching this on the live stream, don't do anything. But if it's outside the live stream, I want you to get the DVD of Silver Streak and start watching it. And as you do, listen to these questions and see if you can answer them. Okay? And I know that some of the actors in this movie are probably still alive. Not a whole lot of them anymore, but we'll take what we can get. So maybe even some of the producers, the directors, whatever, they may still be alive. Who knows? We'll see if anybody can answer these. Now, first question. How many bags did George Caldwell bring with him to the Silver Streak? This is very important, and you'll find out why in a minute. How much was George Caldwell's fare on the taxi? That's never mentioned. How could the guy grabbing George's bags from the taxi cab get the bags if the cab driver didn't open the trunk? That's a nice question. And how fast did that guy unload the bags from the trunk of the cab? I mean, if you watch carefully, the guy probably only had a few seconds, because the cab then whisked away. Watch carefully, you'll see that. Now, George has a first-class compartment on a train, and the partition door doesn't work properly? Really? Okay. A complete stranger asked George how her perfume smells? Really? A grown female on a train like that just suddenly walks up to George without even knowing who he was and asks him what he thought of her perfume. Right. Back then, no. Okay. I'm not sure why I asked this question, but I'll go ahead and ask it. And no one recognizes George? I mean, let's face this. George had edited many books, and I'm sure that his picture was in some magazine or some periodical or something that said he was the editor of books. I mean, and nobody recognized George. Now, I know that not a lot of people probably would, but nobody. Okay. Now, Mr. Sweet doesn't give any. He gives George a bottle of vitamin E, but he doesn't give him any pamphlets or anything about the vitamin E. He just simply makes a statement, there you go. Right? He didn't give anything to George like that? Okay. What was Mr. Sweet drinking? Okay. And George hasn't ever heard of Professor Arthur Shrine. Now, I know a lot of people wouldn't have heard about this guy because he wasn't that well known, but George himself, editing so many books, had never once heard of Arthur Shrine? I don't think so. And what was Mr. Devereaux writing? Okay, George breaks into his compartment and Mr. Devereaux is writing something. What was he writing? And what brand of shoes was George wearing? Okay, because he actually took them off, so he said these are a brand new pair of shoes. What brand of shoes was he wearing? What song was playing? Okay, and what device was it playing on? Was it a cassette player? Was it some special AM/FM radio that they had for the train? I don't know. Okay. Now, that guy that fell off the train, the one that George saw, was there for several seconds. And you're telling me that Hilly didn't see him at all? I know initially she didn't. I know George saw him first, but you're telling me that Hilly didn't see him before he fell completely off the train? Right. Now, George knocks on the door. And you're telling me that Whiny actually opened the door for George without once asking him who he was? Right. And where did Reese come from? Really, he just appeared out of nowhere. Okay, here's another good one. George is thrown off the train, and he actually survives the fall. Interesting. And no part of the train actually hit the cow skull. Really. And George didn't suffer any sunstroke whatsoever. And George's shirt is just not covered in sweat at all. I mean, with as much walking he was done in that kind of heat, he should have been covered in sweat by then. And his whole hair should have been soaked. Okay? And George didn't ask for a glass of water first. He walks right up to Rita, and he doesn't say. He just tells her who he is. He doesn't say, "Do you have a glass of water?" I mean, he should have been parched by then. When George told Rita for the second time what his name was, why did Rita continue to refer to George as Steve? Really? What other animals did Rita have on her farm? Now, there was a group of people celebrating on the Silver Streak when George finally got back on. What were they celebrating? That's never told. And George finally goes back to his compartment. He shuts the door. Mr. Devereaux slaps Hilly, and George doesn't hear that. Right. And what was George smoking? It certainly wasn't a cigarette, because cigarettes don't do what that was. Okay. Now, Hilly, early on in the movie, told George that the professor was a health nut. Okay, that's very important. So why didn't George figure out that the professor was a fake right away? And Mr. Sweet didn't fall off the train? I mean, that guy didn't have the best coordination. Why did Mr. Sweet open the door without asking first who was there? He's a federal agent. Really? Alright. Now, on this one, I'm assuming that they hadn't turned on the lights before they got to the tunnel. And that's why there were no lights. And that's why when he turned it on... Okay, so we'll skip that one. And George didn't put the weapon in his pocket. Okay? Because he was trying to open up the train door. He should have put the weapon in his pocket before he opened the train door. And the spear gun was loaded. Really? Oh, okay, now you'll remember in the movie, after he opened up the train door, he finally got on the top of the train, okay, and George, with hardly any better coordination than Mr. Sweet, George didn't fall off the train as he was confronting Reese. Are you kidding me? And how did George become such an excellent marksman? I'd like to know that. Why was there a train stoplight in the middle of nowhere? That doesn't make any sense. Oh, and George didn't suffer an ounce of frostbite or hypothermia or anything like that. And George didn't see an ounce of wildlife as he's walking along the train tracks. Not one bit of it. Now, George walked into the police station. The sheriff was watching a cops and robbers movie. And George didn't immediately recognize that the action was actually coming from the TV set. He didn't recognize that right off the bat. Now, first the sheriff tells George to sit down, then he says, go get a cup of coffee. Why didn't the sheriff just start by saying, get a cup of coffee, then sit down? And the sheriff, now I know that Rembrandt wasn't always a popular guy, but I can tell you, even I, when I was in high school, knew about who Rembrandt was. I didn't know everything about Rembrandt, but I knew some things about Rembrandt. Are you telling me that sheriff didn't know one thing about Rembrandt? Really? Oh. And the sheriff, when he first saw George, didn't he immediately grab his weapon and put it back in his holster? Yeah, right. Oh, and George didn't see the weapon on the television set right away. Right. And George didn't ask the sheriff's nephew what he actually had. Oh. Suddenly Grover pops up in the back seat. Now, of course, George is turning the wheel right and left like this, but he didn't just spin the car out of control and wreck them both. Man, that guy's got good racer-type coordination. Right. Oh, and the sheriff's nephew left the handcuff keys in the car. Right. Oh, and Grover never thought about the fact that when he tried to start up the car in the used car lot, he never thought about that the sound of the engine would wake up the owner of the place. Right. Oh, how about this? The police never caught up with George or Grover as they stole the car. And George still had cigarettes as they were going all the way to Kansas City. Now, we know where George got the hat, and the shoe polish, and the radio. Where did he get the gloves? Were they in the pockets of the jacket? And you're telling me that after giving $40 to the guy to get the radio, the hat, the shoe polish, all this stuff, and George still had enough to buy 2 more tickets for the Silver Streak. Right. Because you know Grover didn't have any money. And neither George nor Grover had to show any ID whatsoever to buy the tickets and get back on the train. Right. And neither George nor Grover saw Mr. Devereaux reach for the button. And when they went to that back compartment to get the letters, when Hilly got them out of the safe, why didn't she immediately toss them over to George? Oh, and George and Grover survived the fall off the train? Really? And why did Whiny take Hilly with him? And you're kidding me. The cop actually armed George? Really? How did George know that Mr. Devereaux was stopping at Rockdale? Mr. Devereaux didn't tell him that. Whitey didn't tell him that. And the cops actually want George to go with them as they go over to Rockdale, or whatever they were going. And the cops never once attempted to identify Grover. Right. And no one tried to retrieve the Jaguar from Kansas City. You're telling me that the owner of that vehicle didn't contact Kansas City and get his Jaguar back? And when the engineer first saw Mr. Devereaux, even before he saw Mr. Devereaux, why didn't the engineer get off the train? Really? Now, you're telling me that as this train was now a runaway train, it didn't hit a single car or a single rail car as it made its way all the way into Chicago, right? This was one of the best comedies I've ever watched. It really was a very good movie. I'm glad I watched it. I'm glad I watched it all the way through. I have very fond memories of it. I do have it on DVD. I also have it on a streaming. Okay, it's a very good movie. It really is, and it's well worth watching. Even though you have all these wonderful questions, and I'm sure there's plenty more questions you probably would want to ask of this movie. But anyway, those are things that I think you should think about. So, I hope you guys take the time, watch the movie. You will thoroughly enjoy it. Thank you very much for watching this particular presentation. I will tell you more in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.